When I was a child, my grandparents lived near to Chester, and most summers, I guess, along with many Christmases, we'd make the journey north to stay with them for a week or so. And one of the best things about my grandparents' bungalow was that it backed onto the canal. Literally, you could step off the back of their garden into the water, which I'm sure my mum was terrified that we'd do. Most mornings when we were small, this meant a trip outside before breakfast to feed the ducks. Thinking about it now, those ducks were probably enormous. I imagine they worked their way along the canal from house to house, knowing what time the bread would be spread out for them to get fat on. Anyway, by the time my brother Luke and I were in our early teens, we were occasionally allowed out on the canal in my grandfather's rowboat. Sometimes my sisters would come in the boat as well. And that was when I learned how difficult it is to row a boat alongside someone else. Luke had one oar, I had the other, and we spent a lot of time going in circles or zigzagging across the canal as we tried to coordinate ourselves. Neither one of us was really strong enough to row on our own, and so we had to go together and try and get it right, because each without the other was pretty useless. We've been thinking about the gifts of the Spirit this last week or so, and that statement, each without the other was pretty useless, could be true of those gifts. The whole point in the passage in 1 Corinthians 12 is that all of us, no matter what gifts we have, need to work together as God's people. But this is especially true of the final two that Paul mentions. He talks of speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues. Here's what he says 2 chapters later in 1 Corinthians 14. If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or 3 at most should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. The spiritual gift of tongues, of speaking in a spiritual language, is sometimes used in private to help us express something to God when words feel inadequate. Sometimes it's a very private thing. Romans 8 alludes to something like this. But when the gift of tongues is used in a gathering of people, when there are others around, it should always be accompanied by interpretation. The two need one another. Speaking in a spiritual language can seem strange. It can even be frightening to some of us, particularly if it's something we've never heard before. But it is a wonderful gift of God, designed, as all of these gifts are, to build up his people. It's there to inspire us, to help us to draw close to him, to help us to hear his voice to us, and to help us to express something to him. But just like me trying to row that boat on my own with one paddle was useless without my brother beside me, the gift of tongues and interpretation must be used together in conjunction. As God's people, we are all called to work together with one another and with him. And in these two gifts, we have a great example of how, when we are working together properly, the whole church can grow and move forwards.